Buonasera a tutti, good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back any regular listeners and welcome any new listeners and anyone listening online at khbradio.com. Also, be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past episodes. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo, grazie per essere anche con noi anche oggi, mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. Last week, we had a very insightful conversation with experimental archaeologist Farrell Monaco. Together, we explore foods of ancient Rome and her studies in successfully recreating the panis quadratum, a bread baked in Roman times. Her research is based also on the analysis of some of the loaves of carbonized bread that was unearthed in Pompeii. Well, tonight I will switch gears and return to today's days of Italy to talk more about food and the beverage scene of contemporary Italy. And we will start with Kevin Raub to discuss the less known, but yet another area where Italy is quickly becoming number one, and that is Italy's craft beer tradition. But before we get to our guest tonight, let's find out the answer of last week's trivia question. What is the meaning of Dio li fa e poi li accoppia? Well, if you were to translate this expression literally, it would mean God creates them and then pairs them up. So it's usually an expression that we use when we see two people of the same kind, like birds of feather flock together, or tell me your friend and we'll tell you who you are. A man is known by the company he keeps. Sometimes it's used also for, I don't want to say not so positive, but it's usually a comment. It's like, yeah, look at the two of them, they're a perfect pair. But we are almost ready to introduce our guests. A little bit of pubblicità. Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest, Kevin Raub. He grew up in Atlanta and he started his career in the entertainment world in New York. And he has also worked for the Rolling Stone magazine and also freelancing for other publications. And he has covered really everything life has got to offer, from travel, helps and spas, and gastronomy, for a variety of publications, CNN, Travel and Leisure, Condé Nast Travel, and New York Times Magazine, and so forth. And he has contributed to over 100 Lonely Planet guidebooks. Benvenuto al nostro programma, Kevin. Welcome.
Buongiorno a tutti. Grazie mille.
So, first of all, before getting into this new emerging, bubbly, flavorful culture of Italy's crafts beer, let's start with letting our audience know a little bit about yourself. So, where are you connecting from today?
Today I am in Parma, and I'm here because we are finally, after 3 years, updating the next Lonely Planet Italy guidebook. So Lonely Planet basically shut down with on-the-ground research during the pandemic. So we've all been out of work, and we are finally kicking back off again. And Italy is actually, I believe, the first country to be returned to on-the-ground research for Lonely Planet.
Wonderful. And but you're typically based in Bologna. How long have you been there, and what brought you to beautiful Bologna?
Well, luckily, that's sarcasm. I came right before the pandemic. So I moved to Bologna in December of 2019, and we locked down 3 months later. So the majority of the time I've been in Bologna was during the pandemic. So that part hasn't been great, but it's a city that I know very well from previous visits and Lonely Planet research. So it wasn't like I didn't get to know the city at all. I knew the city. I just got to know it from the inside of my apartment. What brought me there? Love, of course. That's I'm the stereotypical story. I came here to do Lonely Planet research 2 editions ago, and I met a woman who is she is public relations for tourism in Bologna, and we hit it off. Now we have a 2-year-old baby. I was living in Lisbon at the time, and I moved over to Italy because it's a country that I love, and I could basically live anywhere. And she sort of had like a nice job that was pretty secure, so it made sense for me to be the one to move over.
Yes, I do see a little guy, Austin Xeno, right?
Austin, yeah.
Posting.
We call him Austin Zeno Superstar.
Okay, so well, Zeno is definitely a very, I associated right away to like Calvino's novel, La Coscienza di Zeno, Zeno's conscience, but it's probably a little, right now it would be a little deeper than a 2-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, when we were thinking of names, of course, all Italians make this association with this novel. It's actually a Greek name. It's not Italian, but most non-Italians don't make this association whatsoever. So for me, it was just we struggled a lot with names that Italians could pronounce and names that we didn't want to immediately reveal his nationality. So we came up with Austin for the first name and Zeno for the middle name. Italians think Zeno's a little weird, and everyone else doesn't make the association with the novel. So it's just, it's a derivative of Zeus from Greece. So
Okay, wonderful. And he looks like he's going to be, he kind of commands the house.
he gets a lot of attention because he's a little biondino. So he stands out around here.
Listen, your Instagram account, and I highly recommend everyone to go and check out Kevin Raub, R-A-U-B, profile, because it's filled with a great a mix of beautiful pictures, and then you have tidbits of historical information, the sites that you're writing about or taking groups, local traditions, and the food and beverage. One of the pictures, there were quite a few that caught my attention, was probably a recent meal in Bologna where you had a dish. It was a spaghetti dish topped with gelato, talking about unusual pairings and how fast forward the contemporary food scene in Italy was. Were you surprised by that?
It was actually in Ferrara, not Bologna, but it was, yeah, it shocked me a bit because they sort of explained the dish to me, and I was like half paying attention. And then I said, gelato, like gelato. And they're like, yeah, gelato. And I'm like, all right. And then it came, and it was, freezing cold. And what sort of blew me away was it starts to melt into the spaghetti. And then within 30-45 seconds, it's a warm sauce because it takes the heat from the spaghetti. And it just was like a very interesting culinary journey in that 30 seconds to go from this freezing dollop of gelato to this perfect seafood sauce. So it was really interesting and creative.
Wonderful. That's definitely something that anyone should try. And then another one that I'm all about, traditions and folk costumes. And I believe you were also in Sardinia during Santa Fizio, in the I guess it's in a province of Cagliari. What was that all about? Because again, the costumes were just amazing.
Costumes are absolutely mesmerizing, and each village has their traditional costume, and there's, I would say, at least 50-60 villages that march through in the procession, 50 or 60 people in each one, male and female, babies, kids, everything, all decked out in these traditional costumes that are super elaborate, all very different from one another. And you can tell that it's like a painstaking process to sew these costumes together and design them. I didn't know what to expect when I went to the procession. I knew just a little bit about it. And the visual aspect of it just blew me away. I mean, it was just fantastic. And then the animals, the horses, the oxen, it was really an interesting spectacle.
So you've been all over the world, but how did you become a travel writer? Because being
Well,
at
I
the right
started
place
as
at the right time.
A little bit, yeah. I started as a music journalist, like you mentioned about Rolling Stone, and I did that for about 10 years. When I actually left Rolling Stone, I trained my replacement, and she ended up being an editor down the road at Travel and Leisure. When I left New York City and I went to LA originally, and I still did music news for another 5 years, but then I moved to San Francisco, and that's a bit of a tougher market for a music journalist because everything sort of happens in LA, New York, and London. So I needed to branch out a bit, and I wanted to get more into travel writing. I was always a lover of travel, but hadn't done much writing about it. And I pitched her an idea on brew pubs in Moscow, which at the time was a novel idea, especially in Moscow, which is a very much vodka-driven society in terms of the drinking landscape. And I found 3 brew pubs that were making their own beer, and that 3 makes a trend. So I pitched her. She gave me the story. So then I had a very small clip from Travel and Leisure, and that just opened up many doors. I mean, it's sort of the holy grail of travel writing in terms of travel magazines for journalists. So that sort of opened the doors, and then it all just sort of snowballed from there. And now I haven't done any music writing in at least 5 years.
But who knows, right? Now, how I came across your work is actually thanks to Dream of Italy. Katie McCabe has been doing a wonderful job with her award-winning PBS show, and then the travel magazine Dream of Italy, and the article dive into Italian craft beer at these 5 breweries. It's an inside scoop of some of your own favorite breweries in Italy. And the article is available for members of Dream of Italy magazine in the April-May issue of 2022. And I personally highly recommend subscribing to the magazine, because you will also have access to all the articles that they have published. And I think they're close to 200 at this point. And then you can start reading and dream of Italy as you read them. So we're going to talk about beer, craft beer, but I also know that you hold a certification. So my immediate thing was indeed to reach out to you, because not only you wrote about it, but you have also certification, so you can really speak up, in detail. So what is this Cicerone certified beer server certification?
Well, it's sort of the top of beer knowledge in terms of it basically is a sommelier of beer, but there's different levels. I only have the first level, which is very easy. I haven't gone on to any of the really challenging levels, so it's not that big of a deal because it's pretty basic. It involves just a couple of days of research and testing, but the true, like the master of Cicerone, I think is the name of the highest level. It's like a year of hardcore study, and it's very, very difficult to pass. So that's really the one that is impressive. What I have is just the entry level certification. So I wouldn't brag about my certification yet. I don't know until I get into the upper levels of the program.
Well, you pair it up with hands-on experience. So, so when we talk about craft beers, birre artigianali, can you explain to us what is the difference between mass-produced beers in terms of maybe ingredients and quantities that a brewery can produce to remain to be considered a craft brewery?
Well, you said in your question that one of the major differences is mass production. So craft beer tends to be small production, certainly compared to traditional industrial breweries. Ingredients, huge differences. I mean, the main ingredients that make up beer are going to be there, but mass-produced beers and industrial beers, they tend to use a lot of adjuncts, which is things they add to beer sort of to stretch the economics. So there's a lot of corn used, especially in the US, a lot of corn used as adjuncts, and craft is just, it's more pure. It sort of sticks to the basics, and then uses very high quality adjuncts, if it uses adjuncts at all. So a lot of times you'll have fruit or other things that give additional flavor character to craft beer, and it'll be just done in a more pure way, in a smaller batch way, with a lot more love and care compared to, you know, a Budweiser or somebody who's just producing mass market beer.
Yeah, and I think there is probably a difference between what is considered the craft beer craft designation between Italy and in the US, because I was reading that in the US, anyone brewing under 6 million barrels a year, and it seems to be a much bigger quantity than what these craft breweries are doing in Italy.
Yeah, I'm sure there's different levels. I'm actually not familiar with the levels in the US, but there are definitely certain levels to be considered a microbrewery, and then you're a macro brewery. And if you just want to break it down for like the average person to understand, a craft beer brewery is just going to be a small, much smaller operation, small production, small batch brewing.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, you know, when people think about Italy, they associate it with wine, but we know that beer is not new for Italians. Actually, before the Italians, the Etruscans had a pretty long tradition of brewing beer, because there are some well-preserved tombs back to the 7th and the 8th century BC that, according to the academic research, obviously the content was a long time evaporated, but while the archaeologists were studying the vessels, I mean, they were able to identify that there was wheat and barley brewed and consumed by Etruscans. So we're going back a long time ago. Is any of these Etruscan tradition translating to our days that you know of?
I'm sure that they've taken some of the original ways of making beer, and they exist today. But I think the in general, the process of beer making has evolved from the Etruscan times, and now we have a much safer, much cleaner, much tastier product than what would have produced before the Romans.
So when we talk about the craft beer tradition in Italy, were there any key people or key dates that we can kind of trace back the birth or resurgence of craft beers in Italy?
There's definitely some key people. There is a man named Agostino Arioli who founded Birrificio Italiano. This is one of the first craft breweries in Italy, and he is sort of credited with coming up with the Italian style Pilsner, which is an Italian tipo Pils. And it's a type of Pilsner that's dry hopped, which is different from traditional Pilsners. And it sort of gives a bit of your old world hop character to an unfiltered Pilsner. And that was sort of put Italy on the map in terms of craft brewing. This was back in 1996, which is pretty early, even by American standards. It didn't take off like it did in the 90s in the US, but he was one of the first, and he was definitely on the front end of things. So that's a style that Italy can sort of call its own, in addition to all the other styles that everyone produces. There's two very Italian styles, actually. The other one is the Italian grape ale, which is quite nice. And it's not my preferred type of craft beer, but it makes an obvious connection between the wine world in Italy and the beer world in Italy, because it uses grape musts to produce. And these two have sort of put Italy on the map, and everything is sort of taken off from there.
What I'm, you know, when I think about, I lived in Belgium as well. So there is a very strong beer culture. Then you have the Czech Republic, England, the US as well. So it's very interesting to see how, again, Italy has indeed developed these, has mastered this craft to the point that some of the beers produced are considered the best in the world. And so when we talk about, I think in your article you mentioned a German law that changed things a little bit for people. Don't ask me to pronounce that word, but I'll call it the German purity law of 1516.
Yes.
What is it about, and how has that affected the craft beer industry after that?
Well, it's really affected the craft beer industry in Germany, because in Germany, it was very prohibited to make a lot of craft beers because they didn't adhere to the law. The purity law, I think it's pronounced Verhangesbote, is it says that beer can only be these four ingredients, and a lot of craft beer has other ingredients in it, and it made craft beer more or less illegal in Germany. And still to this day, Germany's craft scene is behind because of this law. And when you talk about Germany, and you mentioned Czech Republic, and you mentioned Belgium, these are classic European beer countries with very strong beer cultures that aren't necessarily craft.
Mhm.
But because a lot of their greatest beers are not mass produced, they are craft in terms of the numbers, but they are different from styles of craft beer. So that's what makes Italy interesting. I like to tell people that Italy, is not one of those traditional European beer countries. It's a traditional European wine country. And of the traditional European wine countries, so we're talking about France and Italy, and to a certain extent, Germany has quite a wine culture as well. So of the traditional wine culture, Spain as well, Italy is probably the best for craft beer. It has a more a bigger scene, and produces better quality than most of the other traditionally wine producing countries of Europe.
Would you, for anyone that would like to start building a little bit of knowledge, Italy Beer Country by Paul Vismara, is that a good starting point? Would you, as a book?
But I'm sorry, I missed
Italy,
that.
Italy, the book, Italy Beer Country by Paul Vismara.
I'm not familiar with it.
So again, still talking and looking into the craft beer culture in Italy, and it's kind of a little bit of a paradox, because again, you have this wonderful product that is being consumed, and obviously, once I read your article and then I started to do some research, you can find wonderful places all over Italy. As much as you can find enoteche for wine, but maybe culturally it might be a little different, because when I lived also in Ireland and so forth, you have the culture going to the pub and have some pub food. But here, I mean, maybe in the new generation, so to speak, is kind of going away from wine, consider more of their grandparents or their parents um, drink of choice. So we will dive eventually in some of the breweries that you have featured, but something that seems to be also very unique of the Italian craft beer scene is that these master brewers have also food in mind. Um, you can pair beer with food in a fantastic way. You'll have certain beers for, I don't know, appetizers, others for the meats, and so forth. So how do people, and I don't know if you have any favorites or any stories, how do people start to become knowledgeable about craft beer? Are there also some tasting opportunities, some festivals maybe that you have gone to that people can sample different types of beer?
Yeah, well, to your first point in terms of the food pairings, I mean, I think that was a natural evolution in Italy, because in Italy you don't have bars that don't serve food. It's not very common. Like almost everywhere that serves alcohol also serves food. You don't have separation like in the US. The US has bars that serve food, but then the US also has just bars that serve alcohol. And you can go and just drink if you want. And that's less common in Italy. So all the breweries that have tap rooms and things like that, it's going to be a natural evolution that they also served food. But in terms of learning more about it, I mean, practice perfect, I would say. Definitely, there's a lot of flavor profiles that you will start to recognize on your palate if you do some tastings. A lot of breweries, almost all breweries that offer a tap room, they have a taster tray that you can get 4 or 5 very small portions of what they're offering, and you can go through them and see what you like, see what stands out to you. And it's exactly the same as wine. I mean, you have many different flavors and nuances, that aromas that you can project with your palate. And people sit around who know about beer, and they talk about it the same as a bunch of sommeliers would talk about the fruits or the characters of the wines they're trying. It's just as complex, and the flavors are different usually, and the characters are different than wine, but in terms of what your palate can recognize, it's very similar. So once you get into trying different kinds of beers, your palate will develop just as it would if you were just someone who didn't know much about wine, but then you started trying different wines from different regions and different countries, and eventually you start to pick up on the notes and pick up on the small things that your palate notices, and you just learn it as you go, I think.
Yes, because it looks like some of the additional ingredients that contribute to these wonderful flavors might be different nuts I've seen, and fruits. I've seen chestnut being popular, maybe even the shape of the glass or the foam, the color. I mean, there are some things that also visually might help already do a first look of a first assessment of the beer, probably before you go into the actual tasting.
Absolutely. I mean, just as in wine, there's a different glass for each type of beer, and it's for the exact same reasons. It enhances the experience of drinking that particular style, and it enhances the aromas and the character and the flavor profiles of the beer in the exact same way as you would have different wine glasses for different types of wine.
So now let's get a little bit into the places that you have visited, and I was wondering how you went about choosing them first, and then maybe we can dive into talking about each one of them. So, what was your selection criterion?
Well, I wanted to select, I mean, obviously I wanted to select 5 breweries that made amazing beer, but that wasn't enough. I wanted to find places that also offered an amazing experience. So I tried to pick places that offered something unique or offered a more well-rounded experience than just good beer.
Mhm. So you went a little bit from north. Let's start with Alto Adige. There you had the Rifugio Lavarella.
Yeah.
Create the experience for us. Tell us a little bit about maybe if you want to comment on the ambience, but what was specific about the Rifugio. First of all, Alto Adige, it's a beautiful. All the regions are beautiful, but it's a very the scenery is very different there.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the one that offers the biggest experience beyond the drink itself. I actually went there before I did this article, but it's an amazing refugio in the mountains, in the Dolomites, and you have to hike for about close to 2 hours up the mountain. I went in winter. So you hike is, I mean, obviously the scenery is amazing, and you hike for a couple of hours, and then you arrive at the one structure that you pass the entire way. And it's they have beds, and they have a small restaurant, and then they have a brewer who's doing a bit of traditional German styles, and then also a couple of craft things. Just 3 or 4 beers that he does, and it's just like you arrive there after all that work and all that amazing scenery, and you have this fresh, beautiful beer that he pours for you, and it's just really a special experience.
Then you went 12 miles north of Milan, actually the former Pirelli tennis ball factory with
Yeah.
Alder. That must have been pretty interesting. Can you still see anything of the factory? Have they maintained anything?
Well, from outside for sure, you can, it's sort of almost a joke in the craft beer world, but craft breweries tend to be in areas where you need a lot of space. You don't see them in city centers, even in the US. It's usually in a industrial area. You need space to brew beer. So it's the same in Italy, and Italy's space is a little bit more at a premium. And so you're going to see these places taking over old factories. There's a lot of abandoned factories. It's not unique to Italy, and breweries are some of the things that it can become. But yeah, you can tell from the outside that it's some sort of factory. And I picked Alder because the beer is amazing, but in addition to that, it sort of recreates the North American taproom experience, which is still sort of rare in Italy. There's a couple of places that create that, trying to create that same vibe that you would have at a brewery on the west coast of the US, or anywhere in the US, really. There's so many craft breweries now. But so Alder, he draws his inspiration from sort of East Coast craft breweries from the US, and it's a very industrial vibe in there, so you feel like you're drinking in this like hip factory, basically, when the beer is just made steps from your table, and it's well worth a little excursion outside of Milan.
Then you took us to Padua with a crack. Is it Casana or Casana? How do you say Casana? I would say.
Crack Casana, yeah, it means some kind of farmhouse or something. No.
Mm-hmm. And what do you find there? It seems that before I'll ask you another question. Then you can. What is the expected alcohol content in craft beers versus the mass-produced? I have a feeling that probably we're looking at a little bigger numbers as far as alcohol content.
We are. If you want to get into alcohol content that is more on par with more mass-produced beers, then you're going to be drinking lagers and session IPAs. But as you get into IPAs and double IPAs and triple IPAs and stouts and porters, you're moving into the 5 to 8% range, and even like a double or a triple IPA could be 9, 10 even. So they're much stronger beers. You can't you can't sit down and drink 5 of them like you would a Moretti or Peroni or something like this. You'll be 3 sheets to the wind very quickly. So you have to be careful, especially if you're driving.
And so what did you find in this specific brewery then? Single digit or double digit type of beers? As far as
I mean, crack is probably the best brewery in Italy, in my opinion, anyway. And the brewery is Crack, and then they just have 2 locations where you can drink on premises. So they have their original tap room at the brewery, which is outside of Padua. I forget the name of it's like a small. It's the middle of nowhere. It's actually very inconvenient for anyone, because you either have to drink and drive to get there, or there's like one very average B&B that's sort of within striking distance that you could actually stay the night in. And then the new space is Casana, which is an old farmhouse that they took over. It's much closer to the city center, so it's not quite as difficult to figure out a way to drink and not kill yourself afterwards. But they are very much inspired by North American breweries and North American brewing. They do probably the most consistent and best IPAs in Italy. They also do a lot of very strong barrel aged beers, and they do Italian great ales, and they've won awards for all of them. And it's different for Italy because the taproom experience is still sort of rare in Italy, but they've done a very nice job, and they have a huge backyard with picnic tables, and it just feels very much like the kind of brewery you would see in the US. So people who are familiar with that, they will easily be drawn to it, and their beer, the quality of their beer and the variety of their beer is pretty unprecedented in Italy, at least in the places that I've seen.
Then you took us to a UNESCO site, beautiful Pienza, with Brasseria della Fonte.
Yes, this is like totally the opposite.
So if there is also any food that experience that you remember associated with your beer experience, feel free to tell us so that we know what to ask for when we go and visit.
Well, in terms of crack, they do this sort of, they have this bricole, it's called briciole. I don't know if it's like their own little creation or if it's something that's actually Italian, but they do these little like kind of sandwiches and pulled pork, sort of the traditional things you would see with beer, but more Italianized. But at Della Fonte in Pienza, this is more of a one-man show. It's an agriturismo, and the son of the owners of the agriturismo basically convinced his parents to let him take one of these outbuildings and make it a brewery. His name is Samuele, and also inspired by North American brewing. And it's a much simpler, much smaller operation. So you go there, he has 4 or 5 taps, not very many, and 3 or 4 tables. And the beauty of it is he makes very high quality beers. He specializes in barrel aged stouts and porters and things like this, often aged in American whiskey and bourbon barrels. So they're strong beers. But the beauty of it is you're in Tuscany in the countryside, so you have the sort of stereotypical Tuscan views, and it's sort of an amazing place to just sit and have a beer. For food, he just has a little bit of food. He gets some local sausages and things from people around Pienza, and some of the famous cheese from Pienza, but he doesn't have like a full food menu.
And then with the last one, I think you are back onto your home turf in Bologna with the Delbrado Cantina. Tell us a little bit about this place.
This one is, they've only recently opened their tap room. So it's sort of a very industrial experience. And the reason I included them is the particular style of beer that they're doing, which are sours and wild ales. It's much more rare in Italy. There's only a handful of breweries that are doing those styles well. And it's sort of a different flavor profile for the average Italian palate. It takes some getting used to if you're not used to that kind of beer, but they are doing very, very good examples of these styles. And it's just a small little place outside. It's a suburb of Bologna, and probably the best sours in Italy, at least right on par with some of the other more famous sour breweries like Lover Beer. Lover Beer is probably the most well-known sour beer in Italy. So yeah, they're sort of a bunch of young Bolognese upstarts, and they're doing a really good job with the wild ales and the sours. So this is more leaning towards Belgian styles than it is more traditional North American craft beer styles.
Wonderful. And one last question: any beer festivals that people should not miss, or that you have attended that you would recommend?
I've only been in Italy. I've only been to the small festivals that Bologna has, like Microbo. Microbo, I think, is the biggest one in Bologna, but it's not like a big European craft beer festival. Festivals are tough because if you're a craft beer lover, you're immediately overwhelmed and you want to try everything, and you're immediately just drunk. because there's like, oh, you look at the list and you're running around and you're like, oh, there's 50 beers I need to try here, you know. So festivals are great for variety, but they quickly go downhill fast because you just drink too much and then you you get overwhelmed by the whole
Well,
experience.
as I said, we talked about the alcohol content, even just a little bit from each one of them still adds up to quite a bit of alcohol intake. So
Yeah, but it's never a little bit, because you get the festival glass, which is a smaller glass than what you would get in a bar, but it's not like a shot glass. I mean, it's still like a 20-ounce portion. So yeah, it gets very interesting very quickly.
Any future projects that you would like to share with our audience, or where are we gonna see you next?
Well, for the next month, I am updating the Lonely Planet Italy guide, and I'm doing all of Emilia Romagna, which Parma is my last stop, and then I'm doing all of the Dolomites in the Northeast. So it's a huge area. That's where I'll be for the next month, basically traipsing around the mountains of the north. And then I head to the US for a month for a family trip, and then who knows? That's the life of a freelancer. You never know what's around the next corner. I'm doing a couple more articles for Dream of Italy. One is going to be something that I come up with in the Dolomites, but we don't know what it's going to be yet. And then maybe something else in November or so. We haven't nailed that down yet either.
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, thank you very much for this insightful conversation about the craft beer scene in Italy. Now you have added another layer of, a different type of tourism to do, because again, there are certain people that also experience Italy based on a theme. And now there is the whole craft beer world worth exploring. So happy travels and happy riding, and we'll see you around in Italy.
Ok, grazie mille.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.